"You don't marry a man like Vincent Hale and expect a normal first night," the lawyer had said before the ceremony, but I didn't understand what that meant until I stood alone in his house, listening to the silence breathe like it was alive. "My name is Emily Carter, and 24 hours ago I became the wife of a 65-year-old man I barely knew, a man whose presence felt less like a husband and more like a locked door in the middle of my life." The house in Westchester County was enormous, at least 8,000 square feet of stone and shadow, sitting far away from the nearest road like it wanted to disappear from the world. Vincent didn't greet me when I arrived, didn't explain anything, just watched from a distance with eyes that never quite settled, as if even his attention had learned to stay hidden. The wedding had been quiet, almost procedural, a signature more than a celebration, and now that night had fallen, I realized I had stepped into something I couldn't name. Around 11:30 p.m., I stood in the hallway outside the master bedroom, barefoot on cold marble, listening for any sign of him, but there was only the faint hum of a distant clock and the feeling that this house was aware of me. That was when I noticed the rule. A small brass plaque near the staircase, almost invisible unless you were looking for something to question: "Never go to the basement after midnight." It wasn't written like a warning. It was written like an order that had already been obeyed too many times. I should have ignored it, should have gone to bed like a normal person on her wedding night, but something about the way Vincent never explained anything made silence feel like an accusation. At 11:57 p.m., I heard footsteps downstairs. Slow. Measured. Not wandering, but deliberate, like someone counting their own restraint. I told myself it was him, and that I should feel relieved, but instead I felt something tighten inside me, a curiosity I couldn't fully justify. I followed the sound down the main staircase, each step colder than the last, until I reached a corridor I hadn't seen during the daytime walk-through. The air changed there, heavier, as if the house itself had shifted its attention. At the end of the hall was a door made of reinforced steel, slightly ajar, a thin strip of light leaking through like a secret refusing to stay buried. I stood there for a long moment, my hand hovering over the handle, thinking about rules and silence and men who never explained themselves. And then I opened it. The room inside wasn't what I expected. No weapons, no chaos, no cinematic darkness. Instead, it looked like a preserved archive of a life I was never meant to see: filing cabinets lined with labeled folders, photographs pinned carefully in sequence, maps marked with dates and places across New York, Chicago, even smaller towns I had never visited. On one wall was a single framed document, yellowed at the edges, bearing Vincent Hale's name in a way that didn't belong to any marriage certificate I had signed earlier that day. My breath slowed without permission as I realized this wasn't a secret meant to harm people. It was a record of something controlled, something contained. And then I heard his voice behind me, calm and close enough that I didn't need to turn to know he had been standing there longer than I had been in the room. "I told you not to come down here after midnight," he said, not as anger, but as certainty. I finally turned, and for the first time, I didn't see a stranger or a husband. I saw a man standing between me and something he had spent a lifetime keeping buried, and I realized the rule wasn't meant to protect him from me. It was meant to protect me from the truth I had just stepped into. The air in the basement did not feel cold in the usual sense, it felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed down the moment I stepped inside and realized I was not alone anymore. Vincent Hale did not move closer, he simply remained where he was, standing between the doorway and the rest of the room, as though his position alone was part of the warning I had ignored. My fingers were still resting near the edge of the steel door, unsure whether to let go or pretend I had never touched it at all. The silence between us was not empty, it was structured, deliberate, like a conversation that had already been rehearsed too many times in his mind. I tried to speak, but my voice came out softer than I expected, asking why something like this existed under the same roof where he expected me to live as his wife. He did not answer immediately, and in that pause I noticed something strange in his expression, not anger, not fear, but restraint, as if every word he could say had consequences far beyond this room. Finally, he stepped slightly to the side, not toward me, but away from the center of the room, as though giving me permission to see more. "This is not what you think it is," he said quietly, and I realized he had probably said that sentence in different ways his entire life, to different people, in different rooms, for reasons I could not yet understand. He gestured toward the organized files, the photographs, the carefully labeled maps, and for the first time I noticed how precise everything was, how nothing here felt chaotic or impulsive. It felt managed, controlled, almost disciplined. He explained that every name, every document, every location represented moments he had chosen to contain rather than allow to spread beyond control. I asked him what he meant by contain, and there was a long pause before he answered, long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the space between his words. He said he had spent most of his life making decisions that others could not because he wanted power, but because he understood what happened when no one made those decisions at all. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not a man trying to intimidate the world, but someone who had learned to live without being understood. My eyes returned to the framed document on the wall, and I asked him why my name was not there, why I felt like I had been brought into something already in motion. That question changed the air slightly. I saw it in the way his shoulders lowered just a fraction, as if he had been expecting it but still hoped it would not come so soon. He told me the rule about the basement was never about hiding danger, it was about timing, about ensuring that certain truths were never revealed in moments when they could be misinterpreted. He said midnight was not symbolic, it was practical, because exhaustion, fear, and curiosity always made people see things incorrectly at that hour. I should have felt reassured, but instead I felt something else forming, not fear, but a strange awareness that my presence here was not accidental. When I asked him directly why he married me, his answer did not come in words at first, only in a look that carried something heavier than explanation. He finally said that some connections are not created by choice, but by consequences that begin long before two people ever meet. And in that moment, standing in a room built out of controlled memories and unspoken histories, I realized the basement was not the secret. I was. Vincent did not ask me to leave the basement, and that silence felt more intentional than any command he could have spoken. Instead, he slowly walked past me, not invading my space but guiding the attention of the room towards something I had not yet noticed. There was a second desk in the far corner, smaller than the others, with only a single chair positioned in front of it. On that desk lay a sealed envelope, aged slightly at the edges, as if it had been waiting longer than the rest of the room. I did not move at first, because something about the way he stood beside it made me understand that this was not part of the archive I had already seen. This was different. This was personal. He told me that everything I had seen so far was structure, organization, and containment, but what I was about to see was something he had never placed into any system. I asked him why he kept it down here instead of somewhere locked away like everything else, and he answered that some truths cannot be protected by distance, only by proximity to what they might destroy. I reached for the envelope slowly, and he did not stop me. Inside was not what I expected. There were no photographs of chaos, no records of conflict, nothing that matched the silent assumptions my mind had already built. Instead, there were letters, handwritten, carefully preserved, each one dated more than 20 years ago. They were addressed to someone named Eleanor Hale. I looked at Vincent, waiting for him to explain. And for the first time since I met him, he hesitated in a way that felt human rather than controlled. He said Eleanor was his wife before the world learned to call him something else, before everything he built became what people now misunderstood as power. I read a few lines without meaning to, not because I was invading privacy, but because the weight of them pulled my attention forward. The words were not about fear or secrecy, but about responsibility, about choosing silence so that someone else could live without it. Vincent explained that Eleanor had believed in a version of him that the world never saw, a version that existed before every decision became a form of protection disguised as authority. I asked him what happened to her, and he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the letters as if they were still speaking in a language only he could fully hear. He finally said she did not disappear, she simply became the reason he never allowed the world to move without structure again. I felt something shift in the room, not danger, but clarity, as if I was finally seeing the outline of a story that had been incomplete until this moment. I told him that none of this explained why I was here, why a man like him would enter a marriage with someone like me, someone with no connection to any of this history. He stepped closer then, not in dominance but in something quieter, almost fragile in its certainty. He said that when a life is built around preventing chaos, it eventually becomes impossible to separate protection from involvement, and that some people enter your life not because you choose them, but because the system you built eventually requires them to exist within it. I asked him if I was part of that system, and he shook his head slightly, saying I was not part of it, I was the moment it began to change. For the first time since I entered this house, I felt the basement was no longer beneath me, but around me, like the truth had expanded into every corner of the life I thought I had just begun. The envelope remained open on the desk long after I stopped reading, as if the room itself refused to let the story close. Vincent did not touch it again, and instead he stood near the edge of the basement light, where the shadows softened enough to make him look less like a presence and more like a memory trying to hold shape. I asked him why he never told anyone about Eleanor, and he replied without looking at me, saying that some names do not belong in conversations, they belong in silence because silence is the only place they remain unchanged. I sat down slowly in the single chair, not because I felt safe, but because my body no longer knew how to stand inside this kind of truth. The letters in front of me felt heavier than paper, not because of what they said, but because of what they represented, a life that existed before control replaced emotion as his primary language. I asked him if he ever regretted building his life this way, and for the first time his answer came without delay. He said regret was not a useful measurement for survival, only understanding was. I did not fully understand what he meant, but I could feel that every word he spoke carried years of decisions that had no undo button. The basement no longer felt like a hidden room, it felt like a foundation, something that supported everything above it without ever being seen. I asked him again why I was brought here, and this time his voice softened slightly, as if the question had moved him closer to something he had been avoiding naming. He said that when Eleanor was alive, she used to believe that people could enter a life like his and remain untouched by it, but experience had proven otherwise, and he had spent decades proving her wrong in the most controlled way possible. I looked at him and realized that he was not describing power, he was describing containment of consequences. I told him I did not understand what I was supposed to do with that knowledge, and he finally stepped closer, stopping just far enough away to make the space between us feel intentional. He said I was not supposed to do anything yet, only to see clearly before anything else could be asked of me. Outside the basement, somewhere above us, the house creaked softly, like a reminder that the world beyond this room still existed, but felt increasingly irrelevant. I asked him if everyone who entered his life eventually ended up here, in some form of truth they were never prepared for, and he answered that not everyone is brought here, only those who reach a point where ignorance would become more dangerous than awareness. I felt a quiet shift in myself at that moment, not fear, not comfort, but recognition that my arrival in this house had not been an ending to my previous life, but a transition point I had not consented to understand yet. Vincent looked at the letters one last time before closing the envelope carefully, not sealing the past away, but placing it back where it could continue existing without interference. Then he said something that stayed in the air longer than any other sentence he had spoken since I met him, that control was never about power over others, it was about preventing the world from breaking in ways that could not be repaired. And in that silence that followed, I realized the most unsettling part was not what I had discovered, but the possibility that I was now part of the structure that kept everything from collapsing. The next morning arrived without sunlight feeling like a promise, only a slow spreading grayness across the windows of the house that made everything inside feel suspended between decisions. I had barely slept, not because I was afraid of Vincent Hale anymore, but because my mind could not separate what I had learned from what I was still standing inside of. When I came downstairs, the house was already awake in its own quiet way, distant footsteps from staff I had not yet met, soft movements behind closed doors that suggested an entire structure operating around me without explanation. Vincent was not in the main hall, but I could feel his presence in the way the space seemed arranged, as if even absence had been designed. I stepped outside through the side entrance, telling myself I needed air, but what I really needed was distance from the feeling that my life had been folded into something larger without permission. The ground stretched far beyond what I remembered from the night before, nearly 12 acres of carefully maintained land, with gravel paths that curved like they were avoiding direct answers. That was when I saw her. An older woman near the gate, holding a small package that had clearly been returned to her more than once. She looked uncertain, shifting her weight as if she had been told different things by different people and no longer trusted any of them. A security guard stood nearby, not aggressive, just firm, repeating the same instruction about proper delivery procedure. The woman's voice was quiet, explaining that the package contained medical supplies for her husband and that delays could not be repeated because time mattered in ways paperwork did not understand. I do not know why I walked toward them. It was not courage, not strategy, just an instinct that something unnecessary was happening in front of me. I asked the guard if there was a reason the package could not be accepted directly, and he explained the protocol in a tone that suggested it was not personal, only required. The woman looked exhausted, not from physical effort but from being repeatedly unheard. I signed my name on a temporary intake form, not knowing if I had authority to do so, only knowing that the situation did not need to continue as it was. The guard hesitated but allowed it, and the woman's expression changed in a way that carried more relief than gratitude, as if what mattered was not the outcome but the fact that someone had finally paused long enough to consider her words valid. When I turned back toward the house, Vincent was standing on the upper balcony, watching. I could not tell how long he had been there, but I no longer assumed coincidence in anything connected to him. Later, inside the study, he asked me why I intervened. His tone was not judgmental, only observant, like he was evaluating a variable he had not accounted for. I told him it did not feel like intervention, it felt like allowing something simple to happen instead of something unnecessary. He did not respond immediately, but I noticed something subtle in his expression, not approval, not disapproval, but recognition. He explained that systems like the one surrounding his life were built on consistency, not emotion, and that exceptions could create instability if introduced without understanding context. I asked him if preventing instability meant ignoring people when their needs did not fit predefined structures, and for the first time, he did not answer as someone explaining, but as someone reconsidering. He said that once, a long time ago, someone he trusted had told him that order without empathy eventually becomes another form of silence, and that he had spent years trying to prove that wrong. The room felt different after that sentence, as if something in the architecture of his reasoning had shifted slightly. I realized then that the structure I had entered was not fixed, it was being maintained in real time by decisions that were still open to influence. And for the first time since arriving in this house, I understood that my presence here was not only about discovering hidden truths, but about testing whether those truths still had to remain the same. The rest of that day did not feel like it belonged to a single timeline, but rather like different moments layered on top of each other, each one testing whether I would remain passive or begin to notice how the house responded to presence. After the incident at the gate, Vincent did not bring it up again immediately, and that silence felt more deliberate than any discussion could have been. Instead, I found myself being guided, without formal instruction, into spaces of the house I had not yet been shown. One of the staff members, a woman named Margaret, spoke to me gently as she explained routines that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with maintenance, as if the house was less a residence and more a system that required care to function properly. She mentioned Vincent rarely interfered unless something moved outside expected patterns, and I began to understand that my presence itself might now be considered one of those patterns. Later, I walked into a smaller room near the east wing, a space filled with photographs that did not match the tone of the basement at all. These were not records of secrecy, but moments of continuity, images of community projects, building restorations, and people who looked neither powerful nor afraid. In several of them, I recognized Vincent standing at a distance, not at the center, as if his role in these scenes was observational rather than dominant. Margaret explained quietly that many of these projects had been established years ago in Eleanor Hale's name, continuing even after her passing, though she did not use that word directly. She said Vincent never spoke about them publicly, not because they were hidden, but because he believed visibility often changed the meaning of intention. I asked her what kind of person Eleanor was, and she paused before answering, as if choosing between memory and respect. She said Eleanor believed in small corrections rather than large declarations, in helping systems become slightly more humane instead of trying to replace them entirely. As she spoke, I noticed something unsettlingly consistent. Every layer of Vincent's life seemed to contain an attempt at balance rather than dominance, even if the structure itself appeared intimidating from the outside. That evening, Vincent asked me to join him for what he called a walk, though it felt more like a silent inspection of the property boundaries. We did not speak for several minutes, only followed the gravel path that curved through sections of carefully maintained land. Eventually, he asked if I had formed any conclusions yet, and I told him that conclusions felt premature, but observations were becoming harder to ignore. I mentioned the woman at the gate again, and he listened without interruption, not defending the system, not dismissing it, only absorbing the detail of how it had been experienced by someone outside it. After a long pause, he said something that felt less like explanation and more like admission, that systems built to prevent harm often lose clarity about individual moments unless someone inside them is willing to interrupt the default flow. I asked him if that meant he had been wrong to build everything so strictly, and he replied that wrong was not the correct measurement, only incomplete. When we returned to the house, I found myself standing in the same hallway as before, but this time I noticed something different about it, not the silence, but the intention behind the silence. It was not emptiness, it was structure holding itself in place. Vincent stopped near the stairs and told me that most people only see outcomes, not the chain of adjustments required to maintain them, and that understanding that difference changes how responsibility is defined. I realized then that the world I had stepped into was not divided between secrecy and truth, but between visibility and maintenance, and that my role within it was no longer passive observation, but the beginning of awareness that could not be reversed. The following morning felt different in a way I could not immediately explain, as if the house itself had recalibrated after the conversations of the previous day and was now waiting to see what I would do with what I had learned. I found Vincent in the study earlier than usual, not behind a desk of authority but standing near the window, looking out at the property as though it was no longer just land but a set of decisions stretching outward. He did not turn immediately when I entered, and I noticed that silence between us had changed shape. It was no longer purely controlled by him, but shared in a way that felt unfamiliar. He asked me if I had slept, and I answered honestly that sleep had not been the priority, understanding had been. That seemed to register with him more than any formal report or explanation. Later that morning, a small meeting was arranged in the house with several individuals involved in the operational side of the estate and its affiliated projects, though no one referred to them in those terms openly. I was not initially part of the discussion, but I stayed near the edge of the room, observing how decisions were made through structure rather than conversation. The topic was a community initiative tied to one of the older foundations linked to Eleanor Hale's name, specifically regarding resource distribution for families who had experienced delays in essential assistance. The conversation was procedural at first, focused on efficiency and protocol, until I noticed something repeating itself in different forms. Every delay had a justification, but none of the justifications addressed the human impact of the delay itself. I did not interrupt immediately, but I felt the same sensation I had felt at the gate days earlier, that moment when something simple was being made unnecessarily complex. When there was a pause in discussion, I asked a question that changed the tone of the room without raising my voice, asking whether the current process accounted for situations where timing itself became the most critical factor for those affected. The room went quiet, not in disagreement, but in recalculation. One of the staff members responded by explaining constraints, and I acknowledged them, but then asked if constraints were meant to define action or inform adjustment. Vincent did not interrupt. He simply watched. After a moment, I suggested that perhaps the system did not need to be replaced, but refined at the point where it met real human urgency, even if that meant introducing exceptions that were not comfortable for structure but necessary for people. There was a long pause after that. It was not resistance I felt in the room, but reconsideration. Vincent finally spoke, not to defend the existing framework, but to ask how such adjustments would be maintained without collapsing consistency. I told him that maintenance required awareness, not rigidity, and that awareness meant accepting that not every situation could be predicted in advance. After the meeting ended, the room emptied quietly, but Vincent remained standing in the same position for several seconds longer than necessary, as if reviewing something internally rather than externally. When he finally turned to me, there was no correction in his expression, only something closer to recognition. He said that Eleanor used to speak in similar terms, not about systems, but about people inside them, and that over time he had replaced that perspective with structure because structure did not break under pressure. I told him that structure did not break, but people inside it still did. That sentence lingered longer than I expected. Later that afternoon, I noticed subtle changes beginning to appear, not dramatic shifts, but small adjustments in how conversations were approached, how pauses were treated, how questions were no longer immediately dismissed for not fitting predefined categories. Vincent did not announce any change, but he also did not prevent the reconsideration of existing processes. That absence of resistance felt more significant than approval. As evening approached, we walked again along the gravel path, and for the first time, he asked me what I thought Eleanor would have done in the situation we had just observed. I told him I could not answer for her, but based on what I had learned, she would likely have prioritized immediate human impact over procedural perfection. He nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in acceptance that this perspective was no longer external to his world. The house around us felt the same, but the way I moved through it no longer did. I realized then that influence was not about taking control, but about introducing clarity into systems that had forgotten how to pause, and for the first time, Vincent Hale did not feel like the center of a closed structure, but like someone standing at the edge of a system that was beginning, however slightly, to allow change. The night felt quieter than the ones before it, not because the house had changed its structure, but because I had changed the way I listened to it. I stood near the same hallway where everything had first shifted, the place where silence used to feel like warning and now felt more like reflection. Vincent Hale had not summoned me, and for the first time that absence did not feel like distance but like trust being tested without announcement. Earlier that day, I had seen subtle adjustments begin to take hold across the systems I had only recently been introduced to, not dramatic reforms, but careful recalibrations that suggested something inside the structure was no longer fixed in its original form. When I entered the study, Vincent was seated rather than standing, a detail so small it would have been meaningless to anyone who did not know him before. He did not begin with explanation. Instead, he asked if I believed change was sustainable inside something built for stability. I told him that sustainability did not come from resisting change, but from learning how to absorb it without losing direction. He did not respond immediately, but I noticed his attention did not drift away as it once might have. Instead, it stayed, as if the idea itself required presence rather than evaluation. Later, we reviewed adjustments being made to one of the community frameworks originally established under Eleanor Hale's name. The discussion was no longer about whether exceptions could exist, but how they could be integrated without collapsing consistency. I realized then that the language of the room had shifted over time, no longer defending structure as something untouchable, but treating it as something maintained through continuous awareness. Vincent spoke less than before, but when he did, it was no longer to reinforce boundaries, but to refine them. At one point, he paused mid-sentence, as if recognizing a thought that did not belong to his older way of reasoning, and allowed it to remain instead of dismissing it. That moment felt more significant than any formal decision. After the meeting ended, I walked outside alone and stood near the edge of the property where gravel paths met open ground. The air felt unchanged, but my perception of it had shifted, as if distance itself was no longer a barrier but a context. I thought about Eleanor Hale, not as a distant figure in documents, but as someone whose influence had survived not through permanence, but through continuity of intent. When Vincent joined me later, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside me, not ahead, not behind, and for the first time I noticed that positioning mattered less to him than shared perspective. He said that for most of his life he believed control was the only way to prevent collapse, but what he had failed to understand was that control without responsiveness eventually becomes its own form of fragility. I asked him what changed that understanding, and he answered without hesitation that it was not a single event, but a series of interruptions he had once dismissed as irrelevant. He looked at me then, not as someone who had entered his life by arrangement, but as someone who had altered the conditions under which that life continued to function. There was no declaration, no dramatic resolution, only a quiet recognition that the system he had built had begun to evolve in ways that could not be reversed back into its original form. As the evening settled over the property, I realized that nothing about the house had truly changed in appearance, yet everything about how it operated around me had become less absolute. Vincent Hale was still the man who once defined structure through silence, but now that silence carried space within it rather than finality. And I understood then that transformation inside a life built on control does not announce itself through collapse, but through the gradual acceptance that not everything unknown is a threat, and not everything understood must remain unchanged. The morning arrived with a stillness that no longer felt like uncertainty, but like completion slowly settling into place. I stood in the same hallway where everything had once felt like a locked system of rules and silence, yet now the silence felt open, as if it had learned how to breathe. Vincent Hale was already awake, not in the position of observation or control, but simply present in the kitchen as if the house no longer required him to stand apart from it. There was no announcement of change, no declaration of resolution, only a quiet continuity that felt more honest than any formal ending could have been. Over the past days, I had seen the structure of his life shift in ways that were not visible as collapse, but as adjustment, small decisions replacing rigid assumptions, awareness replacing reflex. What had once been a system defined by containment now felt like something capable of response. I poured myself a glass of water and noticed that my hands no longer hesitated in this space, as if belonging had become less about permission and more about recognition. Vincent looked at me briefly and asked if I had decided what I saw this place as now. I told him I no longer saw it as something hidden, but as something in transition, a structure that was learning how to remain stable without remaining unchanged. He nodded slowly, as though that answer aligned with something he had been approaching but not yet fully named. Later that day, we walked the perimeter of the property one final time, though neither of us said it was final. The gravel path felt the same underfoot, yet the way I experienced it had changed completely. Where once I had felt distance and control, I now felt layers of intention and adjustment, as if every part of this place had been recalibrated not by force, but by understanding. Vincent spoke about Eleanor Hale again, not as a memory that weighed on him, but as a foundation that had always been influencing direction even when it was not acknowledged. He said she believed that systems should remain alive enough to correct themselves when people within them changed, and that he had spent too long believing stability required resistance instead of adaptation. I asked him what he thought she would have said about the changes that had taken place since my arrival, and for the first time, he did not frame his answer as certainty. He said she would not have measured success by structure or outcome, but by whether people inside the system were still capable of being seen as individuals rather than functions. That answer lingered in the space between us longer than anything else had. When we returned to the house, I realized I no longer felt like an outsider moving through someone else's architecture, but like a participant in something still being written. There was no moment of departure, no symbolic closure, only the understanding that what had begun as an entry into secrecy had become a process of mutual recalibration. Vincent stopped near the entrance and said that for most of his life he had believed protection required separation, but he now understood that separation without awareness eventually becomes isolation rather than safety. I told him that awareness without rigidity creates something closer to responsibility than control. He did not respond immediately, but when he did, it was not as a man defining a system, but as someone acknowledging that systems are only as human as the people willing to adjust them. As I stepped away from him and moved toward the light beyond the house, I understood that nothing about the past had been erased, and nothing about the future had been guaranteed. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between them, the realization that even the most controlled worlds are not fixed, they are maintained, and anything maintained can also be reimagined. And in that realization, there was no ending, only continuity shaped by awareness, and the quiet certainty that understanding had become the only form of power that no longer required silence to survive.